Welcome everyone to Western Wednesday. This is the first of hopefully many more photography tutorials that I'll do live via Zoom, especially through this quarantine pandemic crap that we're going through. If you guys can just send me a chat, let me know that you can hear me. That would be fabulous. Great. Nikki, Aaron, yes. Aaron, you're the best. Hashtag more Western. Thank you for joining. Bernice, thank you for joining from France. I appreciate that. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly too. And Ashley and whoever is on a Galaxy, it says Galaxy S10. I hope you guys can hear me. The American way, but I like it. Thank you. I appreciate that. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go through some slides and I'll give you real world examples. We're going to be talking about exposure. That's what everybody voted on yesterday for Tutorial Tuesday as part of the first Western Wednesday topic. So here we go. I'm going to wait for questions till the end, and then you guys are more than welcome to fire away. We have about a 40-minute time frame that they allow for these free meetings. And there's a waiting room here, but I will admit people as they get in. So you may hear a slight pause as I admit people. We got to make sure that doesn't happen again. So let's get started. Western Wednesday, Exposure 101. Here we go. First thing I need to acknowledge is a sponsor of this first Western Wednesday. That is UPIC. You can go to upic.com. It's an all-in-one photography platform that has tutorials, website hosting. They also have a shopping cart with that website. The reason that the website that I'm highlighting that here is because I've struggled trying to find different platforms along the way that allow me to sell like my presets, digital downloads, and things like that. This is one of those places that do that. They also host workshops that you can put up on their site. And they even offer an option to provide technical feedback on images from creativity, technical composition, and things like that. And here's this funny thing about it is a lot of people on Instagram, sometimes they'll go, God, I wish I could give it more than one like. And with UPIC, you can give up to 50 likes. That's kind of cool. You can choose from a free or a paid subscription. And if you do choose a premium or a pro plan, use this code Chris50 and you'll get 50% off. So just acknowledge UPIC as a sponsor. Before we get into exactly what exposure is, I think it's important to identify the different photography nomenclature that we have out there, especially if some of you are beginners. And the first thing is something that we call stops. Stops are what we refer to as brightening or darkening an image. And in practical speak, we would say something like, I stopped down to F8 or I stopped up to F4. And what that is, what it means for our cameras and for us is when you are going from, changing your aperture, changing your shutter speed, and the dial that you use to do that, our cameras are set up in third stop increments. So you would click whatever dial that is 3 times. So you go 1, 2, 3, and you go from, let's say, F2.8 to F4, which is one whole stop. And what Ashley says, hang on guys, Ashley says she can't hear anything. So I'm gonna chat back at Ashley real quick because everybody else can hear. So Make sure you're not muted because all others can hear. Okay. The next thing is raw. Raw refers to, when I say that, it refers to an unprocessed image. And AV refers to aperture priority, where you choose the f-stop and your camera chooses the shutter. And in TV, it's exactly opposite. That shutter priority, where you can choose the shutter speed you want, and the camera chooses the f-stop. Then I also talk about floating my focal point, which is referring to moving a little red dot within your viewfinder, which is my focal point, and putting that on my subject to maintain focus. And then white balance we would refer to as the color temperature of our image. And that's something that I generally, when I'm outside, I put on cloudy and keep a nice warm color temperature in my images. And then the ISO, of course, is our camera's sensors sensitivity to light. So what is exposure? Technically speaking, it's the combination of the intensity of light, which is the brightness and controlled by aperture, and the length of time controlled by our shutter speed that the light strikes our camera sensor. Practically speaking, though, it's control of the aperture, shutter, and ISO based on the situation you're in. And I would go even farther and say artistically, it's the creative combination after understanding the relationship between these three things, these three pillars of our exposure. And if we look at the images at the bottom of the screen here, on the left-hand side, we have a barrel racer coming around the barrel, and my exposure settings for that particular image are ISO 200 at an aperture of f4 at 1/1600th of a second. But on the right-hand side, I'm using the exact same exposure at f22 and 1/50th of a second, but I'm getting a much different outcome aesthetically to my image. And for a lot of people that are trying to figure out this exposure triangle, sometimes this can be a little mind-blowing that this is the image on the left-hand side is the exact same exposure on the right-hand side. Now, talking about those three things, the aperture, the shutter, and the ISO, we'll define what the aperture does for us in our camera. It allows what we call depth of field. It's how much or how little is in focus in our image. But it also controls how much light is let through our lens, like a garden hose. I think about it from the aspect of if we turn our garden hose on outside, the water immediately comes blaring out. But if you squeeze that garden hose, like if we're moving over to the right-hand side to f22, then we start reducing the volume of water that's coming out of that hose. And the same thing could be said for our aperture, where on the left-hand side of this diagram, f2 would be letting down as much light as possible. In the middle, we've again stopped it down to f8, or we've made that hole smaller and reduced the volume of light that's being able to get down to the sensor. And then on the right-hand side, we've gone even smaller to an aperture of f22, letting very, very minimal light through. In those three scenarios, when we talk about depth of field, f2 would be a very shallow depth of field, and we would get a lot of blurriness in front and in back of our subject. f8, that blurriness would start to reduce, and f22, almost everything in that image would be in focus, and I'll show you examples of that. So again, if we think about a large aperture being a number of f2, my exposure settings on the left-hand side here, ISO 100 at f1.8 at 1/5000th of a second. What I've done is I've taken that focal point, I've moved it to the horse's eye, and from here, what ends up happening is you get this massive, I shouldn't say massive, but a very shallow depth of field. You get massive blurriness in the image because we're using such a very wide open aperture. But because I'm using such a wide open aperture on a bright sunny day like this is, I need to balance that out with a high shutter speed. So I can't let the light hit the sensor of the camera for a long period of time, or what would happen is I would have what's called an overexposed image. And again, now we go from a small hole, which is a big aperture like f22. I have to shoot at ISO 1600 at f16, 1/2000th of a second. And the reason that I'm doing that is to demonstrate the large or the very broad depth of field that I have in this image. Serendipity would have it that I have this calf coming right by me, and it's in relative focus as well. Moving on to our shutter speed, the second of three pillars in our exposure triangle. The shutter speed is the amount of time that the light hits our camera sensor, but the shutter speed also freezes and blurs our subject. And in this image, we have Casey Field jumping out of the way as Bobby Marriott takes the takes the Bronx and hustles them down the alley. To get those horses sharp and to get them frozen while they're moving, I needed a relatively fast shutter speed of 1/1250th of a second. At this point, I'm not necessarily concerned with my aperture because what I'm doing is just paying attention to Casey as he's moving behind the chutes. And when we move down, through the latter part of the evening and that sun gets in a lower angle, we get a very contrasty style image. And that's why I'm using a higher ISO. A fast shutter speed is required to freeze action. And in this case, as we look at these shells being ejected from the shotgun, I need a very fast shutter speed to stop those shells in air. And the opposite is true with a slow shutter speed. So in that first picture where I showed you that I used f1.8 to focus on that horse's eye, what I'm doing here is I'm using f22 and I'm putting the focal point on the calf as it's running, but because I have such a very narrow depth of field or aperture here, I need to balance that out by going way down on my shutter speed to 1/60th of a second. But in doing so, you introduce a lot of blur in the image. So in panning like this, we show that motion, like in the very first image of the barrel racer. We want to pan with our subject and get that motion blur as the subject is moving. And then finally, the ISO controls our sensor's sensitivity to light. And generally speaking, we would say that the darker the scene, usually the higher the ISO. So the image on the left-hand side is I'm in an arena at a stock dog trial. I'm using a 70-200 lens, which allows me an f2.8 aperture. So I'm allowing as much light as I can down my lens, but I also need a relatively high shutter speed to freeze the action. But to do that, because if you've ever, I'm sure everyone on this meeting has been in an arena, and from a photographer's standpoint, arena lighting is just some of the worst lighting around. So to counteract that, what I need to do is I need to jack up my ISO pretty high, or increase my sensor's sensitivity to light. Over on the right-hand side, what I've done is I've zoomed in 100% to show you the introduction of grain in our images. And that's a downfall to a higher ISO is, of course, we're going to introduce a lot of grain in that image. Now, it's not likely that for this particular image that if someone were to purchase it, they wouldn't purchase it at 100% crop. But if you see, you're going above ISO 5000, 6000, 8000, you're going to be introducing that grain, so you know what's going to happen if someone gets that print. All right. And in this next image, I'm using an ISO 800, and on the right-hand side, you zoom in 100% to the cow's nose, and at ISO 800, there's virtually no grain at all. And with the cameras today, we really find with the newer sensors that ISO just up to 1600, even 3200 isn't bothersome whatsoever. So hopefully everybody's good so far. We'll just do a quick recap. Our aperture controls the volume of light and also gives us that nice blurriness. And that seems to be what a lot of people go for, is we want that blurriness in our image in front and in back of our subject. It also allows us, of course, to isolate our subject. And the shutter speed controls the time that the light hits our sensor, and it also freezes or blurs the motion. And ISO controls our camera's sensor sensitivity to light, and the higher the ISO, the more grain that's introduced to the image. In determining our exposure, we also say things like underexposed versus overexposed. An underexposed image is something that we would say is considered too dark, but an overexposed image is one that we would consider too bright. Now, this morning, I asked my wife, Jo, before I came out to the studio, I just said, would you mind, sitting down for me? I just want to take a couple pictures of you to demonstrate the exposure here. So what I did was, on the left-hand side, I used f2.8 at 1/1000th of a second at ISO 100. And to me, this image is slightly underexposed. I don't know if you can see that, Jo, but Aaron says hi. So on the left-hand side, we would generally say that this is an underexposed image. But on the right-hand side, we would say maybe this is an overexposed image. The truth is there a right or wrong exposure? And the answer is there's not. There's your exposure. If you look back if we go back up here to these two images, to my eye, the image on the left-hand side is underexposed, and the one on the right-hand side is overexposed. I went right in the middle. If you look at these exposure settings, I went about right in the middle, and that's where I like the exposure. One of the things that I do while I'm out on location is I usually underexpose. And what I mean by that is I look at the rim light coming down off her braid and around her shoulder and things like that, and I'll underexpose my image just a bit. So the answer to all this is the exposure is your choice. There's no right or wrong. There's what you like. Choosing your exposure. The first thing I would tell you is use situational awareness, and do that by taking a visual inventory. In other words, what are the conditions that you're going to be shooting in? Is it cloudy? Is it sunny? Are you in a barn or an arena? Because that's going to definitely affect your exposure settings. Do you need a lot or a little in focus? And that would be our depth of field, and the aperture primarily controls that, but there's other factors involved as well. And is your subject moving or is it still? And do you need to freeze or blur it? And if you do, the shutter speed is going to be your control. And then finally, what are the expectations? In other words, if I'm shooting a ranch rodeo, there are clear deliverables that I have to provide as the photographer for the event. Clear deliverables being a relatively sharp image and catching action as it happens. But if I'm at a branding and it's just kind of a free-for-all, there's probably not a lot of expectations on me. In this image over on the right-hand side, this blue ribbon saddle, one of our friends, it's a show saddle of his, and he wanted me to take some pictures of it. He wanted to sell it. So when I set this up in studio, if I go, if I work on this list that I provided right here, what are my expectations? Well, I need to provide some images to my client so that he can use them to sell the saddle. Well, what's important about that? I need to get as much detail as I can in the saddle because the tooling is off the charts here. So to do that, I need a real wide depth of field, not a shallow depth of field. So I'm going to use something like F11 to, carry that focus back. But in addition to that, I'm also going to do what's called focus stacking as well. So in this particular image, I'll take several different pictures of the exact same thing, but moving my focal point from front to back. So if you're looking at this saddle as I have it turned, maybe a little 45 degrees from that front fender to the saddle horn to the back of the cantle over there, I'm going to take several different images and then I'm going to take those and put them together in Photoshop, and I'm going to essentially mash them all together. I want to be able to capture as much detail as I can in this image so that if a potential buyer were to zoom in on this image, they could see every bit of detail, and every bit of that detail is sharp. I put this chart together with some examples. When you choose your exposure, this is, and nothing throughout here is a hard, fast rule. I would never want somebody to take one of my courses or take my workshop and think that, I'm hounding somebody on rules, because I'm not. This is generally where I'm at with the kind of images that I shoot. But I could completely deviate from these at any given time if maybe I'm getting bored or something like that. So example number one, if you're shooting action and it's outside and it's totally sunny, I'm probably going to be at an aperture of f2.8 to 4 with a shutter speed greater than 1/1600th of a second, and I would have an ISO of 100 to 400. You might ask, well, why would you even go up that high with an ISO of 400? And there's a couple reasons for that. One, even at ISO 400, it may not even be an issue. And the second thing is, if you've ever covered a branding or any type of ranch or farming activity, sometimes clouds come, they will come by, and all of a sudden you're in a shady situation. I have a preference when I'm out branding or covering ranch life activity to use my shutter speed to change my exposure. And that's my first go-to. It's very rare that I change my aperture unless there's something really compelling that I need to, get in focus. Example number 2, action, and it's outside and it's cloudy. I'm going to be at f2.8. I'll be at 1/1000th of a second or greater, and my ISO will be 400 to 1600-ish. And in example number 3, if you're outside, if you're shooting action and you're inside an arena, you want as much light to travel down that lens as possible. So I'm going to be choosing an aperture of f2.8 if your lens allows you to get down to or to open up that kind of aperture. With a shutter of at least, greater than 1/320th of a second, but my ISO is going to be 1/3200th to even 6400. In our fourth, fifth, and sixth examples are portraits outside using shade. I'm f2.8 to f4, 1/200th of a second, and between ISO 100 and 400. And in example 5, portraits inside natural, 2.8 to f4, 1/100th of a second, ISO 100 to 400. And in our final example, portraits using inside that are artificial, lit using artificial light like studio lights, f4 to f8, 1/60th of a second or greater at ISO 100. Now, in example number 6, if you guys don't use studio lights at all, Aaron, I know you do because you and I have talked about this a lot. I put 1/60th of a second, greater than 1/60th of a second, because when you're using studio lights, your aperture will, or your shutter speed will control the ambient light. And if you want to introduce some ambient lighting, you'll need to be 1/60th of a second or less. But if you need to get rid of all ambient light, oh my gosh, it says my meeting is going to end in 10 minutes, so we are going to have to hustle it up. You need to be at 1/60th of a second or greater if you want to cancel out all ambient light. And in studio settings, there is no reason really to be over ISO 100 because you're controlling the light and everything in studio. So example 1 through 6, let's get through these. Aperture f4, 1/2500th of a second, ISO 200. I'm outside. There is very little clouds in the sky, and I want to stop that rope. Now, again, I'm outside. I'm shooting action, and it's totally overcast and cloudy. I'm still at f4. I need a fast shutter speed, so I need to boost up my ISO. In this case, 1/640th of a second. And in example 3, one of the worst places to shoot, in my opinion, inside action in an arena. So I need to open up that aperture. I'm at a shutter speed of 1/400th of a second, but I'm at an ISO of 5000. This image here is not cropped at all. This is a full in-frame shot right here. Outside shade portraits, f2.8, 1/800th of a second, ISO 200. This is a natural light portrait, no additional lights. This is an indoor portrait using natural light. I have this gal sitting just off of the doorway. I'm using an aperture of f4, 1/160th of a second at ISO 400. And an in-studio portrait using 100% artificial light. And best practices. Don't use a shutter speed that's slower than the focal length of the lens, meaning if you're using a 24 to 70, you wouldn't want to use a shutter speed. You would want to use a shutter speed that's greater than 1/60th of a second. If you're using a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, we would generally say you would want to use a shutter speed of 1/200th or greater. Now, that said, it's just a general rule of thumb. I can pick out a ton of pictures where I've shot with my 70 to 200 like 1/60th of a second. Subjects moving towards you don't require as fast a shutter speed as those moving across your plane of focus. And that's not a rule of thumb. That's an actual fact that the subjects, if a horse rider is coming directly at our camera, it doesn't take as quick of a shutter speed or as fast as a shutter speed to freeze that subject as it does moving laterally or horizontally. And finally, a creative exposure is an authentic expression of your artistic vision. And always remember, it's not just a snapshot, it's a story. We probably have about 5 minutes for questions. So fire away. Hit up the chat. Let me see if I can get some questions if you have any. Thanks, Aaron. I appreciate that. For those of you, if someone's still typing, I'll just talk. I am recording this meeting and I will be uploading it to my YouTube channel. So make sure that you visit my YouTube channel to see a replay of this. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Great. Thank you, Nikki. I appreciate that. Sarah, thank you. Bernice, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate that. Ashley, thank you very much. I will, and we'll do some more voting on what we will do next. Now I figured out my, nice, good deal. Back to example 3, you showed how much faster on shutter would you need to freeze motion on the feet. So let's go back to 3 real quick. Probably 1/1000th of a second. That's probably where I would be, Aaron, even up to 1/1600th. But to get there is going to be a real challenge, especially with the ISO. I would be going nearly 2 stops, which would be just closing down, squeezing out every bit of light in that picture. It would be very tough. You could add some lights in, but I'm not a fan of that at all. Bernice, have a question about UPIC. You said you're on it. Can I ask you? Oh, you can absolutely DM me. Yep, no problem. All right, guys, before we get kicked out of here, I just want to thank everybody for attending. I will put together another Western Wednesday, and I'll put it up for vote on what we'll talk about next time. For now, thank you, everyone, for joining. I appreciate you.